The sprint, the department acted like any well-ordered bureaucracy in the last dramatic minutes of things, with a great, noisy clatter of habit. Where other agencies might have chosen solemn drums, the Department of Catastrophes relied on the stamped thump of the press, the nervous rustle of forms, and the unmistakable language of office supplies. It was in its way as good a soundtrack as any to a near-apocalyptic sprint Norman P. Ledger had never run in his life. That is to say, he had taken brisk walks to catch buzzes, and had once made a dash for a closing library door and lost a button. But genuine running had always seemed to belong to people with less ink on their fingers and more certainty in their lungs. Yet now he found himself moving through the basement printing room with something like purpose punching through the usual fog of his fear. The room smelled of toner and old paper, biscuit crumbs, disinfectant, and a faint ozone tang where Gideon had been coaxing scheduling daemons into irrevocable kindness. The presses were ancient machines, each one a cathedral of levers and belts, and a priesthood of maintenance memos. Someone had once written in the margins of the manual that these machines tended to sleep when the world expected them not to, which was either a warning or a metaphor. Today they had no time to be metaphors. Gideon crouched in front of a humming rack of servers like a surgeon over an open heart. A laptop on his knees flickered with log files that scrolled like an epileptic stock ticker. He had sleeves rolled to the elbow and a band of cable ties around his wrist that he used as a sort of rosary. Norman watched him work and marveled not at the words that streamed from Gideon's lips. Damon, you're going to be reasonable about this. Now, but at the sight of Gideon's face, which was the exact expression of someone trying to convince a petulant god to behave with a logic gate and a stern face. From the corridor came the sound of voices, not the flat, bureaucratic hum Norman had internalized, but the living, urgent chorus of people who would not surrender their compasses to procedure. Writer's voice threaded through, practical and high with command. Hold the line. One step at a time. Remember, form is leverage, people are not. Keep them between us and the registry until we call. The print operator, a woman Norman knew only as the operator and who had a bowl haircut and an opinion about all office machines, slammed a tray into the press. Paper shivered and accepted ink. Norman had never liked the smell of fresh printed pages. There was a cold definitiveness to it, but now he breathed it like oxygen. He fed the first set of forms through with hands that shook not from fear, but from the knowledge that trembling could be translated into motion. We need 3 copies, Gideon said without looking up, each with a certain chromatic ordering, notarizations in the margins, glue stamper or B depending on which registry we're rotating through, and a seal that won't raise subliminal precedents. Could you translate that into English? Norman asked. Blue, red, blue, Gideon said, and try not to cry on them. It should have been comic relief, but Norman found the words both absurd and calming in the way of absurdities when they line up into patterns. Color, seal. A plea not to introduce saliva into government records. The first sheet slid out, ink fresh as a confession, and Norman exhaled. Around him the department became a choreography of improvised roles. Rita marshaled a corps of Union stalwarts in the foyer and arranged them like human paperweights. Hall, who could have stamped every guest with an infuriatingly polite suspicion, stood inside the doorway as if he were the hinge of the entire enterprise. Tom chalk-paced, vintage tie askew, making wry remarks that were half jokes and half motivational speeches. Aria stood with a red pen like a talisman, her bun immaculate but for a single sensible hair that escaped in the heat of urgency. Enoch, who owned more institutional memory than the filing cabinets did, hovered with his mop over his shoulder like a captain with a polished baton. If they try to push through the directorate, Rita murmured as she checked clipboards for the 20th time, well, raise an immediate labor injunction. It's messy, but it's legal. And Norman, are you ready? Norman wanted to say no. He wanted to say he preferred the forms to remain in their drafts, that his life did not require a last-minute signature to be meaningful. Instead, he found his jaw making the right motions, and the words he said felt like a small and strange oath, him ready to file the forms. "Good," Rita said. "Then file." The security diversion was a thing of humility and theatricality. Hull spent a long, uncomfortable minute arranging himself to look like a serious man arguing about parking permits, and then, when the directorate's cadres arrived down the corridor in neat, monochrome ranks, he and 3 of his colleagues performed something that began as inefficiency and ended as art. They misplaced a stack of very important, but irrelevant visitor badges in such an elaborate and slow-motion manner that the cadres, trained to the point of automatic disdain, stopped to correct them. Bureaucracy miscarried into a trap. A small office printer jam was deployed as a tactical smokescreen. The cadres were forced to take off their gloves and muck about with paper, which slowed them exactly the way that living opposition needed slowing. "Lovely," Tom said, watching the stuttering march of the directorate officials as they tried, absurdly, to find the missing binding comb. "They have the sort of temperament that hates improvisation. Delightful." Azra's contributions were made with an air like someone handing out lucky charms and half smiles. She had arrived carrying a packet of crisps and a roll of paper clips the size of a coin purse. When Norman told her what they needed, she tilted her head and said, "Probability is a gentleman if you ask him to dance. Also, I like salt and vinegar." The miracles she performed were small and domestic, an elevator arriving exactly on cue, a courier's bicycle not tipping as it encountered a pothole, a notary's pen running dry at precisely the wrong moment but then being replaced by an identical pen that had been on no official inventory. None of these acts were untrue to the department's metaphysics. They were merely mischievous, the universe granting micro-reprieves as if winking through a keyhole. Norman found the resulting relief to taste exactly like salt and vinegar. "We can't rely on magic," Arya said, voice clipped but not unkind. "We rely on evidence." "Magic," as she gestured as if erasing the word unreliable with her red pen. "We rely on each other," Rita said, which had the effect of folding Arya's clipped sentence into the human shape it needed to take. The press groaned under the weight of their intent. The first copy, blue under red under blue, came out crisper than any of them had a right to expect. Gideon signed off a digital timestamp that read as metaphor and code, extra minutes granted, clocks permitted to breathe. Norman watched each sheet like a parent watching a child take a step. He wrote his marginalia not as a clerk, but as a human being, small apologies and half phrases tucked into the margins, for the inconvenience, for the mistake, for everything that proper procedure could not encompass. It was at the second press, while Norman fed the next stack, that the directorate made a more direct move. A man in the directorate's uniform, whose face seemed deliberately blurred, as if someone had used a stamp to erase his features, loomed at the doorway and spoke in the particular voice of people who issue moral certainties like weather forecasts. By Statute 413, BI, the man intoned, "No revocation may be processed after the final clause is engaged without the express physical intervention of auditor primus." There was no arrogance in the statement. There was only the flatness of rule. Norman felt what rules do to people. They flatten them, sometimes into shapes you can carry, or sometimes into shapes like coffins. He swallowed and tried to do what he had always done in the face of such declarations: reach for the book, the cross-reference, the marginal footnote that would immunize him. Arya stepped forward like a lever. "Statute 413 BI is context-specific," she said, "and the case in which it applies requires the clause to have been." Said it aloud. "We have precedent. We have witnesses." The directorate man blinked. "Precedent is precedent," he said. "We cannot allow precedent to be loosened on the whim of sentiment." "It isn't sentiment," Rita said. "It's testimony." Gideon gave Norman a look that said, "Press now." Norman did. He fed the second batch through, watching the press bite and spit, and then accept the pages like a steady, obliging animal. The copies stacked up, their edges shining slightly from the friction of imminent legality. The registry had a final desk, a small, humiliating altar where things were stamped and blessed and set down. But first, notarizations, a witness signature, a seal. Hull had arranged the notary to be delayed in the corridor with a preposterous tale about a disputed parking space, which had had the effect of making the notary both irritable and punctual. Missa. Enoch, with his mop brass handle wrapped in an old rag, had produced a cheap sealing device that, to Norman's astonishment, matched an obscure description in a marginal amendment written by a clerk who had been fond of metaphors and goldfish crackers. "Where did you get that?" Norman asked. Mr. Enoch smiled the way someone smiles when they are sharing an old secret. "I keep things that look like nothing," he said. "You'd be surprised what lasts." At the final table, Norman took pen in hand. His fingers were stained with ink in a pattern that could have been forensics or scripture. He had 3 sheets before him and 3 spaces to fill. Each signature would be a small ritual: identity, responsibility, apology. "Remember," Tom said softly, "you don't need to be perfect. You just need to be honest." Norman's pen touched the page. The first signature had the slightly shaky neatness of someone who had practiced steadiness in private for decades, and now allowed it out in public. The clerk beside him, one of Writers' Union allies, who had been trained to witness suffering and to sign in solidarity, initialed the margin. The press shuddered as if in recognition. The second signature was firmer. Something in Norman bolstered. He wrote a line of marginalia beneath it, for the people who make small, unglamorous mistakes and still stand to fix them. They were almost done. Only the third copy remained to be sealed and filed. Down the corridor, the directorate cadres had recovered from their Fox printer jam indignities. They were moving now with the glacial speed and implacable certainty of things that believed their motion was sacred. Auditor Primus was not with them in body, but Norman could feel the concept of Auditor Primus like a pressure in the air, a philosophy of rigidity, a history of fearful absolutes. He imagined Primus as a great stamp that had learned to frown. "They're going to try to stop us physically," Rita said. "We will not allow them," Hull said, which somehow converted a statement of fact into a small poem of faith. At the final moment, when Norman held the third set like a fragile country in his hands, the door burst inward with the polite violence typical of the directorate's decisions. Monochrome uniforms fanned into the room like a formal wind. The leading officer raised an arm and, with the procedural theatricality that made people sometimes feel they were being read aloud at a funeral, declared their intent to confiscate the forms until Auditor Primus could review their legitimacy. Rita's unionists closed ranks. Their clipboards made a human fence that shivered with determination. Aria stepped up and said, quietly, "You will not confiscate these forms because to do so is to convert paperwork into a weapon." There was more force in the sentence than Norman had seen Aria unleash in years. Article 2.1, the directorate's leader said. "No citizen," he stopped. Someone in the back of the directorate's line had fainted, overwhelmed by the smell of printing ink and the humanity of participants acting like they meant it. It was a small, human interruption that bought them another breath of time. Gideon had one last trick. He planted a small device, a legalistic, technical dollop that he called a scheduling daemon backdoor into the department's queue. The effect was not so much to lie to the system as to cough in its ear and say, "Remember when you promised us a breath?" For 32 minutes, the registrar's digital clock would allow marginal exceptions. Timestamps that opened small loopholes where reality might be persuaded to bend in favor of argument and witness. 32 minutes is a long time and a short one. It is long enough for a kettle to boil twice and for 5 unions to rehearse their chants. It is short enough to disintegrate a dozen nervous systems. Norman felt the seconds like a tide. He slid the third paper across the table. Enoch brought the brass-handled mop sealer, pressing the device with the ceremonial care of someone lighting a candle in a church. that had swapped saints for filing clerks. The seal made a small, decisive noise that sounded to everyone as if some small hinge within the world had closed, and not with finality, but with a decision to remain open. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold itself together by the fragile filament of human will. The directorate's cadres lunged. Hall physically interposed himself, a man as steady as a security sledge. Rita's unionists sang, not in harmony, because there was no time for rehearsals, but in rhythm, a rough, human chant that had the effect of framing their action as legitimate protest, rather than a mere civil irritant. The press operator grabbed the stamped documents and ran, as a clerk who had never run before, through corridors she had known as a steady map of coffee, stains and lost receipts. They reached the registry room as the door began to swing shut behind them. A hand blurred and bureaucratically neat reached in, and for an awful second it seemed as if all their careful labor would be confiscated like so many misplaced invoices. Norman shoved with an authority he did not know lived in him. His palm at the small of the door met resistance, and he realized the doorway was not only a threshold but a test. He pushed, the door side open. Inside the registry, a clerk in a robe that looked suspiciously like a lab coat of precedent was waiting with a ledger so vast that Norman suspected it had eaten other centuries for breakfast. He looked up, perplexity written in taxonomic neatness on his face. "Name?" he asked, as though names were manageable variables in a spreadsheet. "Norman P." "Ledger," Norman said. He felt a ridiculous warmth at the right corner of his mouth, where a grease stain, probably from a biscuit, had clung like an old habit. "Purpose: to file Form P arm revocation, triplicate." Norman's voice was both steadier and there's no going back trembling at once. He pushed forward the 3 copies. They were not perfect. There were crumbs at the margins. There was a smudge in the lower left corner of one, where his thumb had not known whether shaking was simply an occasion for grace or an invitation to collapse. There in the margins, Norman had written one full sentence in his handwriting, which was an act of rebellion and clarity both, for the people. The clerk scanned them with a machine that clicked like a curious transistor. The machine coughed. It blinked that slow blink machines when people try to ask them to behave against their programming. Outside, Norman felt the crowd, the human wall, the murmurs. He felt Asia's small rustle of contentment. He felt Gideon like a backbone giving support. Then the ledger clerk frowned. "We have a directive from the directorate," he said. "Auditor Primus has requested that all such revocations be held until a formal review is convened." Norman felt his shoulders cave a little, the old reflex of someone who had spent years letting rules be larger than people. But something else had happened in those years, a slow accrual of small rebellions, of marginalia that rid, "Do this for people." He stepped forward and spoke in the only language that seemed able to outshout statutes, without being shrilly dishonest, testimony. "The forms are correct," he said. "We have witnesses, we have notary, we have seals." He hesitated, then found himself saying the line he had not expected to say aloud. "I made the mistake. I misfiled a stamp and I accept responsibility. But we are more than our mistakes. We are the people who will undo them." Somewhere beyond the registry, the directorate motioned as if to reply. Norman waited. There was a small symphony of office sounds, the registrar's stamp tapping half a beat like a heart, Rita muttering the union's liturgy under her breath, Gideon making a soft counting noise like prayer, Hull breathing like a man standing guard. The clock on the wall quivered, then resumed. "We will take them under advisement," the clerk said finally, an answer dressed modestly as a pivot. "But the advisory period will necessitate a review." "When?" Tum asked, voice thin at the edges. "At the earliest convenience for Auditor Primus," the clerk said. "Which means when Auditor Primus is ready." The room seemed to deflate like a paper bag from which someone had drawn a slightly embarrassing secret. Norman felt the heat of near success and the cool of imminent challenge at once. They had done what they could. 3 copies filed, seals affixed, signatures witnessed. They had moved mountains with staplers and heart, but the door had not closed. It had merely opened a corridor. Auditor Primus would not be content to leave the matter to the registry's soft equivocations. If one could call a philosophy, he would arrive with the severe dignity of an institution that kept its absolutes polished and primed. He would arrive to ask whether their small, human solution was an acceptable precedent. Outside, the Unionists cheered, not because the battle was over, but because the act of filing meant the battle had been fought honestly. Norman felt tired in a way that was both ancient and entirely new, exhausted as if he had run a marathon wearing a suit, energized as if he had learned to run not only to save the world, but to save a biscuit-sharing afternoon. They had the forms, they had the evidence, they had, crucially, each other. And somewhere, in the avenues where statues of policy stood and historical documents burned with the low, smoldering light of myth, Auditor Primus began to restructure his expression into something that suggested he was preparing to arrive. Norman's pen, which had left tiny autobiographical smudges on the margins of state, felt like an instrument with purpose. They had won the sprint. The race was not yet over. A single sound came from the corridor, the measured stamp of an approaching presence. It was not a footfall so much as a punctuation. Norman, standing amid the smell of ink and biscuits and the faint confetti of paperclips Azra had let fall, realized the next moment would require not just paperwork, but a kind of courage that could be witnessed, and would have to stand up against an institution that measured destiny with rulers. He closed his eyes briefly and then opened them. Someone nudged his shoulder. Tom, probably, with that old smirk softened. Norman straightened his spectacles and tucked his pen behind his ear like a soldier choosing a banner. "Ready?" Tom asked. "As it'll ever be," Norman said. And so, as the registry prepped a room and the directorate marshaled a philosophy into a person, the department held its breath. The sprint had carried them this far. The next step would require more than speed. It would require argument, imagination, and the stubborn insistence that forms belong to people as much as the other way around. Outside the door, a shadow detached itself from the monochrome line and advanced with the deliberation of a stamp about to be pressed. Auditor Primus was coming. Inside the room, someone turned up the tepid kettle in a small, ridiculous show of faith. The sound of boiling reminded Norman of a domestic life he had almost given up, the half-burnt toast, the late-night poems, the small acts that keep a life stitched together. He had filed the forms, he had started the facts of mercy. Now he would have to explain why the Department of Catastrophes should be run by people who could laugh at their own memos. The door opened. The world leaned in. The tribunal looked, at first glance, exactly as one might expect a tribunal designed to adjudicate the end of worlds to look. Long, severe benches, a daze like a ledger, a smell of old rabbit skin parchment that made everyone's throat go dry. But the Department of Catastrophes never did anything by simple expectation, and so between the shelves of archived seals, each one lined in a neat, loving alcove and labeled in polite script things such as plague, third wave 1063, and rain that refused to evaporate 221, a tiny brass kettle sat on a stand, perpetually sending up a thread of steam that never quite condensed. The steam smelled faintly of lukewarm tea and compromise. The chamber itself was lit with a light that had been patented in 19 protocols and then promptly reclassified as ambient dignity. The light made the paper look solemn and made hats look like policy documents. Auditor Primus arrived not with a flourish, but with the precise sound of a stamp striking a page from a great distance. It did not so much stride into the room as it settled with an ecclesiastical hush, like the closing of a particularly decisive file. Auditor Primus was, to use completely insufficient words, monochrome. It was a figure in a uniform so immaculate the creases seemed to cut the concept of a crease in half. Its face was less a face than a blurred impression, as if an overzealous stamp had been applied to the idea of a face, and then smeared slightly before drying. If one looked closely, one might have sworn that sometimes, in certain lights, the blurred area rearranged itself into what one could generously call expressions: approval like a neat corner fold, disapproval like a crease. It was all in keeping with its station. The Directorate of Finality had never been one to enjoy metaphors, preferring instead to work in appendices and footnotes and January. Norman sat at the plaintiff's desk, his spectacles a little too far down his nose, and his tiny stapler conspicuously out on the table like a defensive talisman. Around him were allies inked and winded from their own labors. Aria's blazer was immaculate, but for a single rumple at the elbow that seemed to evidence some private exertion. Rita's bright scarf made the union binder look like a small flag. Tom sat as if the tribunal were a particularly tasteful joke he had decided to wait out with dignity. Mr. Enoch's-Mop leaned in the back of the room like a modest, pointed witness. The members of the tribunal arranged their policy memos. These were thick cards of brown paper bound with string, each one stamped and annotated until the raised ink looked like hieroglyphs. They moved them with deliberation, like priests arranging relics, and when auditory Primus spoke, the sound was not so much speech as the settling of parchment. "We will hear the case," Primus intoned, and everyone felt the room's air contract minutely in deference. There were formalities to be observed. Aria had already submitted a lined, triple-ink memorandum in which she used words like precedent and compassion in the same sentence, which had made the Directorate consider faintly contradictory possibilities. Rita had presented an exhibit of worker grievances folded into the shape of a dove, and had been politely refused the right to fly it across the tribunal. Azra had offered an affidavit written in confetti and metaphors. It had been accepted on the grounds that confetti, when precise, was still technically a form of filing. Norman had his papers, trimmed and annotated to the millimeter. He also had his marginalia, those tiny hand-scrawled clarifications that looked on a border like tiny flags raised against the tide of procedural language. He had the peevish little poem he kept in his desk drawer tucked into his breast pocket, unread except for a furtive glance now and then. He had the memory of a biscuit shared under a hiccuping fountain. He had the story of the midwife who pulled a baby into the world with 2 hands and a paperclip to spare. He had, in short, what the Directorate liked to call extraneous material, and what the rest of the office called the human part. The hearing opened with formal accounts and objections. The mid-level clerk's miswriting of memos was replayed like a tragedy in 3 acts. Gideon's log files were read aloud in a voice that made numbers sound like oaths. The corporate auditors, who had been invited by a quorum's oversight, waved brochures about outsourcing the end the way other people waved programs at the theater. Norman's first impulse, as always, was to be small. He arranged his papers, checked his stapler, considered the rules he could quote. The rules were many and comforting. They were also terrible, because rules had once been the only thing standing between a cosmic adolescent's enthusiasm and the utter dissolution of polite society. He had, for years, believed that if one followed them exactly, nothing would happen that one did not already expect. But rules could calcify. Rules could fail to notice the person stuck behind the machine that printed destinies. Rita began. She spoke of unions and of workers who, in the face of abstract protocol, still needed to go home to someone. She spoke in plain, steady voice about how mechanical certainty often hid human suffering. Her testimony was procedural in the way of a hammer, and it landed with a thud that produced small sympathetic vibrations in the tribunal's margins. Tom followed. He confessed he had the look people get when the punchline is no longer funny and the laughter is long spent. He spoke of a prophecy he had kept folded in his wallet for years because he had been ashamed. It was not grand in a prophetic way. It was a private thing that said, people will still bring biscuits for each other, even if the world forgets where the biscuits belong. He had suppressed it because it contradicted a report he had once filed recommending tighter redaction. Now he unfolded it and let it fall onto the table like something odd and warm. Then Mr. Enoch, the janitor, stood. The room experienced a small, involuntary shift. You could have heard a paperclip straighten. He did not speak with the portentousness of a prophet. He did not cite legislation. He did not wave a policy memo. He cleared his throat, which sounded faintly like a kettle deciding whether it had anything to offer, and began a parable. Once, he said, there was a house made of paper. It was a house that kept its rooms catalogued and its chairs in orderly rows. One night the teapot broke and the tea spilled everywhere. The house's rules were very clear about tea safety. The rule said in so many words that if the teapot broke, you must call the council and wait for an appliance committee to decide how to make the teapot not break ever again. The people in the house waited and waited. The tea stained the floor and the children grew sticky and learned that certain sweetness was worth the bureaucratic delay. Then a neighbor arrived with a pan and a string and tied things. She mended the teapot enough to pour, not to guarantee, but to continue. The council eventually came and sealed the floors and wrote a manual and painted a sign. The house was safe. But sometimes you could still see a small scar on the floor where the tea had been, and sometimes the children would tell the story and laugh. He let the story sit between them like an offering. The tribunal listened, the hold music which, in an insulted universe, continued to play the department's official oral motif stuttered on a minor chord, and then rolled on as if rehearsed to do so. There is always a moment in which institutional language slips. It is not dramatic so much as inevitable. The language that is designed to be absolute discovers that there are holes in the paper it is printed on. Auditor Primus did the ritual cough that meant it had catalogued this parable under emotional extraneous evidence, and would therefore have to decide whether to file it or not. It decided to everyone's palpable surprise to listen. Norman felt his throat tighten. He had not planned to be the one to speak from the heart, because Norman's heart was an archive, and an archive's heart is usually written in passive voice. But hearing Mr. Enoch's parable made the right words feel like a small thing waiting to be laced into form. He stood and read, not law but story. The midwife who had used a paperclip to tie off an umbilical cord when the field kit had been delayed by a hiccuping boarder. The teacher who had stayed to help a frightened child file their name when registration servers froze. The man who had given his only biscuit to a colleague on the afternoon city clocks stopped agreeing about the hour, and it had been, for a while, enough. He did not deliver these as exceptions in a legal treatise. He delivered them as if they were evidence but not evidence that fit into neat boxes. He unfolded his marginalia, the little notes he had made in the margins of ancient charters, and read the literal marginalia of an ancient, long-dead clerk who had once annotated, "Remember, policy is for people, not the other way around." At that line, someone, perhaps it was Azra, sighed in a way that sounded like a breeze rearranging confetti. The tribunal shifted on its cushions. Even the corporate auditors looked momentarily ill at ease. Auditor Primus did not display faces in the human sense, but the impression of its features moved. There was a rippling in the blurred stamp. It made a sound like the gentle uncurling of a rubber stamp's edge. "Precedent," it said. The word dropped into the room and landed like a weight on the sealed binder of the department's future. "We do not deny human value," Primus said. It then went on to explain, in a voice that suggested it had once been a man who loved footnotes more than he loved people, why precedent mattered. History has shown, it intoned, that ad hoc interventions lead to variable outcomes. Without rigid adherence to procedure, smaller errors beget amplified consequences across temporal topologies. We exist to prevent the early improvisational mistakes of nascent reality. We are the dam against entropy's less subtle enthusiasms. Norman listened. He could see the contours of fear in its wording, the fossil of a catastrophe embedded like a shard. He had read about the early days in the protocol archive in footnotes that were written in a hand that trembled with terror. There had been, once, a well-meaning committee whose improvisation had unleashed a season of storms that rearranged several schedules irrevocably and had caused a cataclysm of birthdays to occur on single, crowded afternoons. The directorate had been born from that fear. Tom, who had until now been held in reserve by his reluctance to draw attention to his own errors, leaned forward and spoke in a voice that was both rueful and pure. "We are not asking for lawlessness," he said. "We're asking for room to be human in law. Not every pause is a prelude to ruin. Sometimes it's a chance to be brave." The corporate auditors shuffled their brochures distractingly. Arya, whose red pen had lodged itself temporarily into her hand like a knife of clerical resolve, rose and told the tribunal of a time she had broken protocol subtly, with a memo that saved someone she loved. She did not say the whole story. There are things supervisors protect in the margins. But she gave the tribunal enough to know sympathy was not an abstraction in this office. And then there was a silence that had nothing to do with the rules, and everything to do with the fact that those present were, despite everything, people who had once been reached by other people's kindnesses. The silence was a soft, dangerous thing. It implied decision. It implied change. It smelled faintly of a teapot's residual warmth. Auditor Primus considered. There was a moment in which the smear that constituted its face looked almost reflective, as if the blurred area might be studying itself. "If we allow exceptions," it said finally, "we open a precedent. That precedent might be used in ways we cannot foresee. You ask us to permit a remedy that is, by definition, creative." Norman wanted to say, "That is the point." But procedural restraint sat like a polite cough in his throat. He remembered the tiny poem in his pocket and thought of the biscuit under the hiccuping fountain. He thought of Mither, Enoch's parable, and Tum's younger self, ashamed and secretive. He felt the weight of a decision become, for the first time, a weight he had the courage to lift rather than catalogue. "We ask not for anarchy," he said, "but for mercy that can be demonstrated. Let us provide the evidence you require. Let us show you with witnesses, with testimony, with the janitor's parable and the midwife's clip and the teacher's patient hand that people are worth the risk of precedent." Auditor Primus made a sound like an agenda being inspected. "You propose then a remedial act on the basis of human testimony and demonstrable instances of improvised aid," it said.
"Yes."
Norman's voice was steadier now, less the squeak of someone who feared their own shadow, and more like someone who had just realized the shadow was someone's shoulder to lean on. "We present not chaos, but a catalogue of care. We present rational testimonies and human consequences. We will assemble evidence that the Directorate can log, verify, and reproduce if needed. We will ensure that any exception is framed with safeguards to prevent caprice." There was paperwork to be described, forms to be filled, new tags of oversight. It was arguably the Directorate's favorite part. Regulations loved to love others by requiring them to swear loyalty in triplicate. Primus sat very still. The impression of its face shifted in the way of a stamp absorbing an extra drop of ink. "We will accept," Prime said after a time that felt like several minutes but was technically 1 minute and 22 seconds. "A non-standard remedy if and only if someone very important signs a revised clause acknowledging the remedial act and the attendant precedent." The room made a sound. It was the sound of relief and the sound of a new, small problem being formally introduced into the world. Norman felt his knees go wobbly in a way that had nothing to do with physical stamina and everything to do with the fact that the path ahead required convincing an administratively reclusive being who had a taste for solitary tea. "Then we will go and find that signature," Rita said, smiling in the fierce, organized way union reps smile when there are bunders and a future to be worked toward. "We will gather witnesses and clear the affidavits. We will make sure it's airtight enough for a stamp to rest on." Primus' blurred visage for an instant, almost human inclined. "Proceed with caution," it said. "We will adjudicate not only the present but the precedent." "This tribunal remains vigilant," Norman exhaled. Somewhere in the ceiling of filing cabinets, like somebody reading the morning's news. The mood in the room, previously a palette of dread and decorum, lightened to something like anxious hope. It was not yet redemption. It was not victory. It was an arrangement that allowed the next step. But the arrangement itself was not without sting. For an instant Norman thought about the alternative the directorate had offered, neat erasure. The thought was seductive in its mercilessness. It would have wiped the slate clean, taken away the messy human parts with a fast, clean motion. There would have been no lingering hiccups, no small villages singing in thirds, no tiny scars on tile floors where tea had spilled. Norman felt the temptation. He felt also something like grief at the thought of losing what made the world worth saving, the biscuit sharing, the improvised help, the failed exam that had pushed him into clerical life, and then secretly taught him to read poetry by lamplight. He had chosen, which is to say, he had chosen to let messiness leave a precedent. He had chosen to ask the world to be kept in its untidy, beautiful way. The tribunal would grant him the conditional assent he needed, and now he would have to go get someone very important's signature. Outside the tribunal, files resumed their low, bureaucratic hum. Somewhere down in the department's basement, a forgotten clock decided to show its face 15 seconds slow on Tuesdays and found it liked the habit. Norman steadied himself by closing his fist around his tiny stapler. He realized, never been more terrified in his life. He had never been more ready. Auditor Primus made its final note as the chamber recessed. "Prepare your evidence. File it in triplicate. We shall review under the revised clause." There was a murmur of activity, a rustle like leaves in a legalist wind. Norman stood, his marginalia still warm in his pocket like a secret. He glanced at Aria, at Rita, at Tom, at Mr. Enoch and Azra, at Gideon, who had slipped into the back with a stack of sanitized logs. He thought of the midwife, and the teacher, and the biscuit. He thought of precedent as a kind of promise rather than a trap. The hook on the end of the afternoon was small but sharp, in the corridor as they left. A clerk, Norman, did not know, a face smudged with the exhaustion one gets from working late on forms, looked at Norman as if he had just witnessed a minor miracle and then slipped a small, folded scrap of paper into Norman's hand. It read, simply, in handwriting like a tentative policy memo, "They will sign for biscuits. They will not sign for fear." Norman looked down at the scrap, then at his stapler, and then back at the tribunal's doors closing. Somewhere inside the directorate, a drawer had been opened that had not been opened in a very long time. The sound it made was not dramatic. It was precisely like the click of a past being considered for a new form. He pressed his thumb to the paper until he felt the print of the letters. Then he folded it and put it into the margin of his newest packet, where he had an empty place for notes. The office lights hummed on. The kettle, somewhere, breathed politely as if waiting for direction. Norman felt a sudden, improbable courage. He had a job to do. He had stories to collect. He had to find someone very important and find a way to make an argument out of biscuits and parables and marginalia. And as the department resumed the business of keeping the world from making improvised mistakes, Norman walked out into a corridor that smelled faintly of lemon polish and possibility, and the last thing he heard, as the tribunal's door clicked behind him, was the brief, indecisive rasp of Auditor Primus' blurred face making notes. It was not yet a yes, it was not yet a no. It was the sound of a system that had been certain, thinking about being surprised,